Good day, everyone, and greetings from the United Nations in New York. I'm Ramu Damodran with the United Nations Academic Impact, and we're all very grateful that you've joined us today for this conversation. This is part of our series 75 for 75, which attempts in the course of 75 minutes to have a conversation on issues that are pressing on the United Nations agenda and to try and see how an interaction between practitioners and academicians can help rethinking some of these issues as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations and indeed look forward to the centenary of the United Nations in 2045. Today's particular topic is rethinking radicalization. And I'd like to go back to the time when we were debating and discussing and defining the Sustainable Development Goals. And when the Secretary General at that time, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, said in his report that what is of concern is the radicalizing effect of the multiplicity of websites, Twitter feeds, and other propaganda run by violent extremist groups on the internet. While it is rare for an individual to be motivated to conduct a terrorist attack solely through exposure to radicalizing influences on the internet, the effect of this material is twofold. First, it glorifies terrorism and promotes it as a tactic. And second, it attracts support for terrorists beyond the immediate area of their operations. So this report, in a sense, fed into the conversation on the SDGs. And a year later, as you know, in 2015, the General Assembly adopted those goals, one of which, SDG 16 on peace and conflict resolution, specifically asked that the world community strengthen national institutions, including through international cooperation, for building capacity at all levels, in particular in developing countries, to prevent violence and combat terrorism and crime. Fast forward to 2020, and just a month ago, when we had begun to come to grips with the COVID pandemic, and Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in remarks on the issue, said, extremist groups are taking advantage of COVID and its lockdowns to intensify social media efforts to spread hatred and to recruit young people who are now spending more time online. Now, for us at the United Nations, this has been really, in many senses, a multi-pronged approach. There are various offices of the United Nations that have been dealing with this, offices of the international system, and we're very privileged in today's conversation to bring in some of those offices along with academic practitioners, or in the case of our first speaker, someone who's combined both the practitioner in leading efforts in a department of the United Nations and has a formidable academic background as a professor back at the Hitotsubashi University in Japan. And I'm referring to Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, the Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, whom I'm privileged to invite to lead our conversation. Madam High Representative, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was a few minutes late. The Secretary General called me. I had to answer some questions related to biological weapons sites. It's a real pleasure to be part of this panel. I think this is one of the most important issues that we have at hand. And as you all know, issues related to radicalization online has been very much on the agenda. It's been very much in news at the global level. And as a result, the UN has been very active in thinking through what are the things that we should be doing, we can be doing together with partners in the civil society and also academic field as well. Let me just step back and talk about how difficult things are in the virtual world or the cyber world, as we say, especially since the COVID-19 crisis started. One tremendously positive side, of course, is that thanks to those digital technologies, we have been able to maintain connection, stay connected, and have this kind of events also. This is all because of digital technologies. But at the same time, the technology also has a dark side. It's reported that more than 600% increase in cyber attacks since the COVID-19 started. Also, something like 300,000 suspicious websites have been created ever since the COVID-19 crisis started. And more worrying thing is that there have been so many of cyber attacks against hospitals, health institutions, research facilities that are doing very important research into producing vaccines and medicines, etc. So what we need to do is to try and put our heads together and think about how to maximize the positive aspect of digital technologies. It will be absolutely crucial to use this digital technology, for example, in the recovery and rebuilding phase from the COVID-19 pandemic. But at the same time, we have to really try hard and minimize the negative side, dark side of this digital technology. And that includes, of course, use by, or I should say, misuse, abuse by terrorists and terrorist organizations. Both in terms of spreading extreme ideas, but also recruitment purposes into their terrorist organizations. Now, there have been, as I said, many things happening at the international level, also at the United Nations platforms as well. I think one of the things that you obviously are all familiar with is the Christchurch call, which has been also deeply involved by all of us, the world leaders, and led by also the Secretary General himself. There are a lot of colleagues, my colleagues from Office for Counter-Terrorism, that have been looking into those various actions that have been taking place at the United Nations level. Because of the agendas, today's agenda's focus, I just want to mention very practical examples that we have been doing, which is not directly touching on the terrorist views or exactly about the radicalization, but overall, we believe that it is really about creating more secure and stable cyberspace. And two things that I want to talk about just very briefly is, first one is what we called apps for digital peace, which is a very interesting initiative. Normally, the UN does not do this kind of initiative with a partner international non-governmental organization called Cybersecurity Tech Accord, which is a private industry company, institutions coming together and jointly working from their own perspectives to create standards and normative approaches to stabilize and making sure that cyberspace remains a peaceful one rather than being abused, misused by wrong actors. We partnered up with Cybersecurity Tech Accord and created this contest called App for Digital Peace. And this is a context that invites young people to propose original mobile applications, apps, and other technology-based solutions to both help limit the use of internet as domain of conflict, and also to increase the security and stability of our online environment. The contest is currently open for submissions, and the deadline for submissions is 30th of July 2020. So I would like to use this opportunity and invite a lot of young people to think through a technology-based solutions and participate in this contest initiative. The other one that I want to you mention as just a very pragmatic, practical example that we have been initiating is our Youth for Disarmament initiative. And this is really educational learning opportunities, also networking opportunities that we have created together with member states of the United Nations, as well as regional organizations and civil society and academic institutions, to promote a meaningful and inclusive participation and empowerment of youth on disarmament and non-proliferation issues. Now, this goes back, in fact, to the original thinking of the Secretary General himself when he launched his overall initiative called his Agenda for Disarmament, which is a very comprehensive set of agenda. I'm not going to go into all the details, but one of the four main pillars of this disarmament agenda is partnership for disarmament. And within that partnership for disarmament, he really emphasized the importance of working with young people. And by the way, as a side story, I should say that when he needed to launch his agenda for disarmament, he really thought that such a comprehensive agenda should be launched outside the United Nations compound, in particular with a main audience being younger people. So he chose to launch his agenda at a university in Geneva. Really goes to show how he thinks that working with younger people and in fact empowering and also providing the right kind of skill sets as well as expertise and knowledge to think through what might be the important approaches in the 21st century on those issues from amongst the younger people will be absolutely key. So against this background, the first committee of the General Assembly also endorsed for the first time unilaterally a resolution that the UN really should be working with younger people for the cause of disarmament. And this obviously is not specifically about combating radicalization, but this goes very deeply into preventing the misuse of online technologies by various institutions and groups, including, and I would say most importantly, by radical extremist and terrorist organizations. So we are in the process of really articulating what are the kinds of training needs, learning opportunities that the young people would like to be interested in and wants to be engaged in. So Youth for Disarmament initiative is created to cater to their requirements and interest. And it's I am very happy to say that there has been a lot of very interesting and I would say enthusiastic reactions coming youth organizations that are starting to work very actively with us. So I'm sorry, I went over the 5 minutes timeline that was given to me, but since this is supposed to be an interactive panel, I'll be very much looking forward to engaging with conversations with all of you. I would like to again thank you for this initiative. This is exactly the kind of initiatives and discussions that we need to have for all of us, especially at the United Nations, to become much more creative and innovative in working with, importantly, younger people who have the power to start changing the way we work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary General Nakamitsu, or with your permission, Professor Nakamitsu. And thank you so much for showing us two immediate instances of rethinking that you've been the lead on. The first, of course, as you say, the very unusual experiment or project where the United Nations is working with a private company on the Digital Peace Contest and Initiative, which I hope many of us joined in will take back to students and to younger people. And secondly, the conscious desire of Secretary General Guterres to take the United Nations not only beyond First Avenue, New York, but beyond the Atlantic as well, by launching the Agenda for Disarmament at the University in Geneva. Thank you very much for that. It's now my privilege to invite Mr. Masood Karimpour, who is the head of the Terrorism Prevention Branch at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which is headquartered in Vienna. Mr. Karimpour has worked in the field on these issues in the Middle East, in North Africa, Central Asia, and brings to us a perspective both from the headquarters and the field side. So, Mr. Karimpour, welcome.
Thank you, Ramu. I appreciate this opportunity. And then, of course, thanks to UNAI for really organizing this very timely and urgent discussion. And your introduction captured it quite well. Really nothing further that I can add, except a little bit of perspective from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. And to do that, of course, I would also join the statement from the Undersecretary General for Disarmament, who also gave us a very good snapshot. The fact is that during this COVID crisis, we've really come face to face with what I think is the urgency of this issue, as internet use has nearly doubled in some countries. We've had so many more young people spending more time on the internet because of homeschooling or because of being confined, and so therefore being exposed an almost captive audience to so much of the both criminal and radicalizing elements online. Now, of course, we talk about the Christchurch terror attack as the most recent example of when harmful content has been shared online, and as a result, really woken up the world community. And the Christchurch call that followed itself was, I think, a catalyst for further discussion, but also action. And that's where UNODC comes in. UNODC, UN Office on Drugs and Crime, despite its somewhat misleading title, also beyond the drugs and crime, which also encompasses terrorism. After all, we are talking about violent extremism and terrorist acts, all of which are just a series of criminal acts, and are both prevented and investigated and prosecuted and adjudicated through the same criminal justice system that addresses crimes generally. And that's, again, where our mandate comes in, which is the criminal justice angle of preventing violent extremism. And so coming back to the most recent, what I would describe as aggravation of these issues during COVID-19, we've seen ISIL weaponize this crisis, framing it as divine intervention in support of ISIS's quote-unquote struggles against Western countries. We have seen ISIL call on its members to quote-unquote show no mercy during COVID-19. And indeed, we have seen an increase in their activities online during COVID-19. So as the world recognizes and really becomes globalized in many sense, but also because of this recent turn of events, has almost become captive audience and users of the internet, really exposure to violent extremism, messaging, and radicalization is of growing concern to many countries. So the question you might ask, and your audience might ask, is what can countries do to mitigate some of these challenges? Well, you start with, and this is based on our experience working with delivering technical assistance to many countries in preventing violent extremism and in implementing the UN Secretary General's plan of action against violent extremism, is we encourage countries first to adopt an effective and a very inclusive national PVE framework, policies, strategies, and plans of action. And we emphasize inclusive here because we've also seen these approaches done in a way that is exclusive of women, exclusive of outreach to the youth. How do you prevent violent extremism among the youth if you don't involve the youth? Might be a very good question to ask. And we've seen these plans of action also be excluding minorities and the marginalized. And by minorities, I mean religious or ethnic minorities. And so we really encourage countries to be very inclusive and to turn who they believe are elements in society that challenge society and turn them into allies. The fact is, violent extremism is often grounded in root causes, and these root causes are grievances against the government, grievances that go to being excluded. And so in your counter-terrorism and your countering violent extremism approach, if you go ahead and exclude even further the very communities who you want to prevent violent extremism in, then one might say you're shooting yourself in the foot, or you're just throwing fuel on the fire. And so we have seen whole of society approaches, which we encourage countries to adopt, which are very effective. And on this note, I would like to emphasize the role of women. The fact is that preventing violent extremism, as well as countering terrorism, comes mostly through knowing who's doing what. And by that, I mean who's preparing to take violent action against your communities. And you only do that through gaining information early on so that you're in a position to do something about it, to prevent it. And that information comes from society. It doesn't come from paid informants. It doesn't come from institutions. It often comes from ordinary people who love their family and love their community and don't like to see it torn apart by violent extremism. And we need to encourage those people to step forward and give information. I'll give you one example. In Sri Lanka, the Easter Sunday attacks, we just observed the one-year anniversary of that horrible attack against churches and hotels, killing lots of innocent people. You know that many people in the villages reported information to the authorities that there are these radical elements coming into our community and trying to radicalize our youth, and they're trying to recruit them for terrorism. Unfortunately, that information wasn't acted upon, and so the terrorism acts ultimately took place. That's a separate matter, which goes to institutional ability, which I'll address in 1 minute. But right now, I want to focus on the fact that information that could have prevented those attacks actually came from the communities. And guess who among those communities were the first to report it? The women, the mothers. They will and have acted as canaries in the mine. They are the most aware of what's going on in their communities, and they're most protective of them. So when an intelligence official in a country told me, well, you know, I can't act on intelligence that I never received, I say, yes, that is true, but you also can't blind yourself to half of the intelligence available out there if you refuse to hire women to be intelligence officials, if you refuse to recruit women at the institutional, at the leadership, and at the operational levels, in order to mainstream gender perspectives into this. You know, women aren't just suicide bombers. They're also people who can prevent terrorism. And so that's something that's a message that we have been emphasizing, as to give you an example of what I mean by an inclusive approach. And so, of course, once you have those policies in place, we encourage institutions to also build up their capacities, a capacity to collect and to act on valuable information. But also in terms of interagency cooperation. Often we see one agency has very valuable information, but won't share it with another agency in the government. And we have seen also international cooperation being lacking, in the sense that country A has information about a radicalizing group that's operating in several countries in the region, but won't share that information with the other countries concerned. And we often find that when we step in, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime steps in and provides the blue flag and provides a confidential forum around which countries can come and share information. We find that the jigsaw puzzle that this country has and the jigsaw puzzle that the other country has together provide a whole picture, and then allows both countries to act decisively against violent extremists and terrorists. And I can tell you with absolute confidence that these forums and this sharing of information across borders has revealed terrorist attacks in the planning stage which were stopped. Suicide bombers, suicide vests, explosive, targets, innocent civilians, lives were saved because of the international cooperation that the UN encourages and facilitates. And we need to see more of that in order to counter violent extremism and terrorism. And of course, this work goes on quietly because when nothing blows up, there's nothing to report in the headlines. But that's fine because I think the countries are more focused on saving lives than making headlines. And so we also are looking at the internet as the place where much of the radicalizing and the fundraising and even the operationalizing takes place. And so in order to police that space, and I would invite colleagues here, I appreciate the Undersecretary General's comments that we wish to see cyber space used for peace. I like to see it also used for not committing vast crimes. And so I tend to come at it from the perspective that the internet is a crime scene or a potential crime scene. And those people who have the authority and the opportunity to police that crime scene, to prevent crimes from taking place, to do so more effectively. And here is where UNODC brings capacity to the national authorities to help them develop internet referral units, to identify where harmful messages and harmful terrorism activities and violent extremism is taking place, and to report it, and to work with service providers to remove it. And just to tell you that based on the work that we've done with many countries, we have operations now in 150 countries, not all of them focused on this particular issue, but just to tell you the network that we do tap into in order to reach countries that need help and to give them technical assistance. We've helped develop regional PVE networks at different regions, most recently in Central Asia. We've helped countries develop the PVE plans of action, the government of Philippines, the government of Maldives, the Sahel, and the SADC regions. We helped them develop a first inter-regional PVE initiative. We've helped establish a network of experts on the terrorist use of internet and digital evidence. And to give you a very practical example of where this work delivers results is we've developed a practical guide for requesting electronic evidence across borders. So if country A has evidence that the terrorists were using the internet in their country, but they need that evidence, they can use our tools to go to the service providers in California and get that evidence immediately. I think that you're trying to get my attention because I've overrun my time. I apologize to all colleagues. This is a topic that deserves exploration in depth. And again, my apologies for running extra over time. I stand by for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. No, my apologies. It was only that we wanted to also, as you say, have some time for discussion. But thank you again for rethinking the idea that the UN must also be very careful about whom it excludes, not only whom it includes, and of course the role of the individual. And that brings us right back to the Charter and the reference to the dignity and worth of the human person. So when the human person values her or his dignity and worth, then it's up to that person to make sure that the UN and society at large further that protection. Thank you so much. I'd now like to invite Ms. Samantha De Silva, who is the Senior Social Protection Specialist at the World Bank, working both in social protection and education, to share her views from another pioneering multilateral institution. Ms. De Silva?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
So this whole area of education and violent extremism is a rather new area for the World Bank. We're just getting into it. And so I have focused my presentation very much on what you asked us to do. You know, you said focus on priorities for the future as well as obstacles to achieving them. And I wanted to focus on some of the most fundamental issues that we face in the sector as we sort of start engaging. My perspectives come from working in Afghanistan. I was based there, as well as DR Congo, Nigeria, Somalia, etc. Countries that are facing serious issues to do with radicalization. And what you realize is that just as much as drivers of conflict in each of these places are different, drivers of radicalization are also different. And it is not a one-size-fits-all approach that we can take, because it becomes very important that all of the efforts that we make are very context-specific. So, for example, while in Afghanistan, it is poverty and ideology that pushed young people to become radicalized. Mr. Karimpour just discussed Sri Lanka. You know, the Easter Sunday suicide bombers were educated upper middle class youth. In Bangladesh, the attacks were carried out by middle class youth with a secular education. I believe one was enrolled in a PhD program. So we need to sort of understand what we are dealing with here first. Since the September 11th attacks, of course, the terms violent extremism and radicalization have become, you know, a part of the development lexicon. But yet, these terms lack a specific definition. This makes it very difficult for us to carry out research, policy dialogue, or even to agree with programming. I do know that, you know, some bilaterals as well as UN agencies have developed sort of working definitions. However, these are also not consistent. And this is quite a problem for us at the World Bank, because we work directly with governments. And labeling a group an extremist group is highly politically charged. Being listed as such has, of course, as you know, serious repercussions. They can be barred from contact with international agencies, they cannot receive funds, etc. And so we have to use the terms quite carefully and often without much guidance on how to use these words. Governments also sometimes hesitate to use these terms because they can have negative effects in terms of country risk ratings, tourism, FDI, etc., foreign direct investment, etc. I mean, in Sri Lanka, 11 years after the civil war, it is still a debate as to whether the LTT should be labeled a terrorist organization or not. And I think this is something that we really have to come to terms with, and to have some sort of an agreement on how to move forward. Adding to that confusion, sometimes the terms radicalization and violent extremism are used interchangeably. This doesn't help us because the relationship is not automatic, nor is it direct. An individual can be radical without necessarily carrying out violent acts. So I think language is quite important when we talk about these issues. We also need to make a distinction between violence driven by religious ideology and violence driven by poverty. Because for development organizations, how we frame this topic is very important in terms of whether we get traction in a country or not, in terms of policy dialogue, for example. Religious motivation as a driver of violence cuts across class lines and is particularly complex. The most important distinction here is between violence motivated by worldly outcomes, for example, a regime change or a different redistribution of resources, versus violence motivated in order to be rewarded in the afterlife. In the former, one can offer better ways of achieving the same goal, but in the latter, it is much harder. And this has been an issue for us. The issue of violent extremism is also hard to address because we don't have clear evidence on the root causes of support for violent extremism. And I think Mr. Karimpour referred to this as well. We also don't have a consensus on the relationship between education and violent extremism. Some researchers have found a positive relation between higher education and involvement in terrorism, while others have said it is uncorrelated. A recent World Bank study, I think it covered 8 Arab countries, found that lack of adequate employment opportunities for educated individuals fuels support for violent extremism. So that's slightly different. Yet in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan, what we found over and over again is that the higher echelons of the extremist groups are educated, but the foot soldiers are joining just to make a living. And again, these have implications for policy dialogue. There is also some evidence that a key factor for violence is rooted in perceptions of injustice and marginalization. Now, regardless of whether lack of education in and of itself is a driver of radicalization, we know that education can be used to radicalize and de-radicalize young people. So it is an important tool to address some of these push-pull factors that drive young people towards extremism. However, countering violent extremism through education requires that we distinguish between 2 types of interventions. One is addressing, as we said, the root causes, providing access and quality education to address issues with marginalization, inequality, unemployment, female empowerment, etc. In other words, as we mentioned, the root causes. Secondly, we have designing targeted location-specific CVE programming. So you need to do both at the same time. And again, this is not an easy thing to work on and to get right. Some of the lessons that we have learned in terms of education and violent extremism is that we need to address high dropout rates. And again, how we do this is very important. We know that high school dropouts are particularly vulnerable to recruitment by extremist groups. And this has serious implications for policy interventions. And when we do these policy interventions, whether it is using social media or internet, or whether it is cash transfers, as a policy tool, when we do this becomes very important. Advocating for decentralized local initiatives that give voice and agency to young people become important. Key drivers of violent extremism can only be understood, again, as we said, through localized research, because responses must be context specific. Semantics and labeling become very important because we must avoid securitizing the education sector. And this is very easy for this to happen, I find. We often find ourselves in meetings using words that you usually would not use in the education sector. A program that is labeled as countering violent extremism sometimes can garner negative reactions from the community and sometimes in itself becomes a target of radical groups. This is something that's quite important to me, is training teachers for addressing violent extremism. Often, we think teachers can be trained to detect early signs of radicalization. And we often, look at the Western countries, we look at the models used for dealing with narcotics in classrooms or students using narcotics. But what we don't realize is that in these Western countries, there are a lot of support systems that support the teacher in how to deal with this. And the teachers, whereas the teachers in Afghanistan or in Pakistan or Sri Lanka usually don't have these the support systems. They can't turn to the Ministry of Social Welfare to say, here's a student who's being radicalized. Please now provide them the necessary support, or make sure that they get access to the various systems that are in place so that they can get the necessary help. I remember an Afghanistan teacher telling me, it's almost better for me not to know, because short of me bringing that kid into my house and mentoring the child, there's very little I can do once you identify that a student is being radicalized. And it's very similar, actually, even for abuse. The teachers just don't have the necessary support systems to address some of the issues that we are asking them to get involved in. The other is, I think, what we spoke about previously, that extremist groups seem to be especially adept at using social media to connect and create social cohesion among these groups. ISIS alone has hundreds of online platforms, including some 50,000 Twitter accounts. Yet the education sector in many of these countries hardly ever use social media to engage the youth. We also have very little research on the role social media can play in education programs, supporting CVE interventions, and very little information on the impact that they have. So we need to focus on teaching children not just the hard skills, but also soft skills such as leadership training, communication, negotiating, etc., because these are the tools and the skills that they will rely on to sort of be better citizens, which will hopefully make them less prone to buying into some of the more extremist ideology. There is also, what we found is that in many countries, there are tons of small CVE initiatives and pilots, but very few rigorous impact evaluations. And so these, so the effectiveness of these programs are very much anecdotal. And for the World Bank, for example, we can't really say, let's invest $100 million in an approach, let's scale it up, if we don't really know that the results are cost effective and that they're going to have sound impact. It becomes very difficult to advise governments to just invest in CVE for the sake of investing. So these are some of the issues we have faced as we start working in this. I know the UN has been involved a much longer time. So I'm here and I hope to learn from the presenters, but also to learn from the audience, because I'm sure we have some rich experience in terms of the people participating here. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed to Samantha for her presentation and for highlighting the problems that comes with terminology, the root causes, the assessment of the dual role of education in addressing these root causes, and also to resolve the issue of radicalization. So we thank you very much indeed. And now we have the privilege to introduce Dr. John Sanabria. He is a psychologist and serves as the Dean of the School of Public Safety at Ana G. Mendez University in Puerto Rico, which is the UNAI principal hub for global citizenship education. He has been involved in training of law enforcement and has conducted extensive work in community prevention programs and research on homeless youth, on youth development and empowerment, addressing issues such as gang violence and its consequences. Dr. Sanabria, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Omar. Good morning, everyone. Talking about radicalization and the role of the universities, we have to say that among many roles, the main role of the university is to educate competent professionals. Now, as Ms. De Silva was mentioning right now, right before me, a lot of our youth don't even get to complete high school, so fewer of them get to engage in university education. So we have to understand that university students are a very small portion of the youth in our communities. Now, when we have those youth in the universities engaged in education, we have to understand that our main role as universities is to create competent professionals. Competent professionals that are capable citizens actively engage in their society in a variety of roles that go beyond their professions. Those competent professionals must demonstrate knowledge, skills, attitudes, and critical thinking. And it is the university's responsibility to provide the environment, guidance, and support for the development of those. Breaking those elements down, the first component is knowledge. Field specialist professionals must have knowledge of the world they live in, both the natural world and the cultural world, and a profound understanding of the profession. That knowledge is, of course, necessary. However, we're not close to calling it a day. It is not enough. it is fundamental that universities also teach the skills to apply that knowledge, and applying that knowledge in their professional role, and applying that knowledge in implementing its participation in society. But to apply their skills correctly and to participate positively in their community, they also need to have a caring approach, an attitude of service, and, in general, attitudes related to the values of their professions. Finally, and most importantly, competent professionals also have a mind of their own. They can comprehend the situations presented at them and make informed decisions based on their skills, but also based on their attitudes and values, as well as the values they adhere to when they choose a particular profession. Therefore, the role of the university goes well beyond providing knowledge. The role of the university includes modeling of attitudes to give shape to critical thinking, the reinforcement of professional execution and citizen participation. And that role begins from day one and never finishes. So in regard to radicalization, it is the university's responsibility to expose students to all kinds of ideas and to present various points of views and frameworks to understand new and old concepts alike. Universities must be safe places for students to argue and to debate and to assume positions. But also, universities must also make clear with students the consequences of acting or not acting on those positions. In other words, in the universities, the students must feel safe to express all kinds of ideas and positions, but faculty must also feel safe to confront students with the consequences of their choices before they actually go and execute them. Not discussing all possible sides of an idea, not providing a safe environment for discussion, not confronting students with the possible consequences of their actions will inevitably lead to some students to search for other outlets where to share their convictions. And those other outlets may have a more radical agenda, taking our most passionate and capable youth in the direction of polarization and hate, as we see too often, as we are seeing right now. Thus, in conclusion, assuming that we have the most capable, the most passionate, most privileged youth in our society that managed to get through high school without dropping out and managed to get into higher education institutions, we must take advantage of those minds, of those passions, and we must allow them to discuss their ideas, present them with the consequences of their ideas, safely discuss all the possibilities of action and not action, and take advantage of that information, as was mentioned by Mr. Kariminpour. Faculty have that first-hand knowledge of their ideas, of the minds of these students, of these young people who are interacting in the world, both physically and online. And faculty know these students, faculty hear these ideas, faculty have an insight into their possible radicalization or not, and faculty have a responsibility to act, and institutions have the responsibility to support the faculty in those actions, in modeling, in shaping, in providing guidance on how to understand, make sense of their world, make sense of their situations, make sense of the inequalities they perceive, the lack of resources that they perceive, and give the students, the future professionals, the tools, the space to practice safely how to productively and passionately act for the benefit of all when they become future professionals. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to Dr. Sanabria for your insights and for highlighting the role of academia, of institutions, and of course, the responsibility of faculty and universities themselves in the prevention of radicalization. Now I have the honor to introduce to you Mrs. Ana Maria Cardona. She is the Director of Partnerships, Community Engagement and Communications at the Center for the Prevention of Radicalization Leading to Violence, located in Montreal, Canada. Prior to that, she worked at the International Center for the Prevention of Crime and at the Interdisciplinary Center for Development Studies, headquartered at the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. Mrs. Cardona, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the United Nations Academic Impact for this invitation, and more particularly Omar Hernandez for his guidance. Thank you so much. I was given 5 minutes for this presentation, thereby I will be very precise. So what I will propose to you is first to get to know more about the organization I work with, so you can better understand my point of view regarding this issue. Then explore with you the role of higher education in combating radicalization and violent extremism online. And finally, some takeaways. So let's begin. The Center for the Prevention of Radicalization Leading to Violence is an independent, non-for-profit organization. We are based in Montreal, Canada, and we have a provincial mandate for the entire region of Quebec. We were created in 2015, and with the financial support of the City of Montreal and the Quebec government, and also the active involvement of community and institutional partners. Our mission is basically to prevent radicalization leading to violence and hate-motivated behaviors. We have a community-based approach that places education, public awareness, community engagement, and mobilization at the heart of our activities. We develop a broad range of resources like training programs, workshops, awareness-raising campaigns, documentation tools, among others. And we have to provide community support for people that are directly touched by these phenomena, example, individuals, families, organizations. How do we do our work? Well, actually, we work in collaboration with partners from all backgrounds, and because there are other institutions working as well in this field, we work all together to achieve the same goal. I think the most important thing to understand is that we, the center, we are just a community-based approach. So to talk more about the role of higher education in combating radicalization and violent extremism online, I will just invite you to talk about some facts about social media, which is one of the most prioritizing things we are doing now. So we already know people use social media to influence people's opinions, expectations, and beliefs. Information spreads very quickly online, and its global reach allows people to get in touch with a huge audience. Social media is a very effective tool to spread hate speech and propaganda. It is a way to encourage and easily promote violent extremism. There is a good potential for anonymity, and it's not easy to track. And lastly, fake news are everywhere. And we know for certain this is one of the biggest challenges we are facing nowadays. So now I want to share with you some ideas of how to prevent these facts. Well, one thing that we know is that if you want to prevent radicalization leading to violence and hate speech online, you need quite a few things to go on the same time. You need people to have access to correct information. You need people to have the skills to interact with those who have very different points of view from them. And you need to be exposed with people that think different from you. So now I would like to share with you some approaches and learnings that we have here at the center, and to talk more specifically about the role of higher education institutions. Offline programs and projects can also have an impact for online behavior, and we're actively working with this approach. First, I would like to share to you that higher education institutions are very important spaces to talk about this. You know, fake news, hate groups, terrorism. Parents, for example, won't feel always comfortable to talk about it. And within other spheres of interaction, people won't talk about these issues that sometimes are perceived as taboo. This means we need to provide professors and all the higher educational personnel with the support they need. They need to recognize and understand behaviors. They need to identify risk and protective factors. And they also need to understand how to intervene in an appropriate way. So it's in this context that we have created different tools, trainings, webinars, and nowadays we have hosted also other webinars according to conspiracy theories and hate speech, cinema and radicalization, because our goal is to provide the support and information that we need to address to do things online and offline. We have also learned that, you know, youth are actors of change, not in a passive way, but in an active way. We must support students to promote spaces for dialogue. So I think I already have more than 5 minutes, but I will just to give you some takeaways from this conversation. One, it's to promote spaces for social engagement. You need to empower youth and open spaces for dialogue, because dialogue is a powerful tool to build resilience. And you need to give frontline workers and education professionals the tools they need to address different situations. I will invite you to consult our website, www.anfo-radical.org. So maybe this can give some inspiration and ideas, and we will be very glad to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed to Ms. Cardona for her insights and for underlying the position of professors. They need to support them, and they need to see the universities as spaces for dialogue and interaction about these critical issues related to radicalization. So we thank you very much indeed. And with that, we are now going to proceed to show the audience a link to the survey that was prepared by the UN75 team within the United Nations. And this is a survey that can be filled out online. And the idea is that the organization in this 75th anniversary since its foundation wants to hear from you about the critical topics of our times and about the topics related to the global UN agenda. So my colleagues are going to post the link in the chat box, and also to showcase the slide where you can see the link, un75.online/partner/UNAI, which is the acronym of UN Academic Impact. So in the meantime, those of you who would like to comment on what you have heard so far, or you would like to pose any questions, please do so in the chat box. Please indicate your name and affiliation and type your questions, and we will compile the questions and present them to our guest speakers. If you can read out the online survey, you can see that the very first questions comes to the priorities that the international community must have to recover better from the ongoing pandemic of COVID-19. Then, how do you see the world 25 years from now? Which is the global trend do you think will most affect our future? And finally, how important or not it is for countries to work together to manage the both trends. And of course, we are seeing the importance of multilateral cooperation when it comes to the ongoing pandemic. How's COVID-19 changed your views on cooperation between countries? And do you think that people in 2045 will be better off, worse off, the same as you are as today? And finally, if you have any comment or any possible advice to UN Secretary General to address these global trends. So please, we invite you to fill out this form. The United Nations would like to know your thoughts and comments about this. So once again, please, if you have any comment or questions to our guest speakers and panelists, please do so through the chat box. In the meantime, we also invite you to visit our website, which is academicimpact.un.org, when we publish articles and news items related to our UNAI member institutions around the world. We have over 1,500 universities and colleges around the world in all continents that support the 10 fundamental principles of UNAI, which is an initiative that aligns institutions of higher education with the goals and principles of the United Nations. Also, in our website, you will see a list in the tab of news and events, a list of the the future online dialogues that we are going to host. The next one will be actually this Thursday at 9 New York time, when we are going to discuss the role of higher education and universities in the combat of climate change. So we thank very much in advance, and we are going to post in that website of ours not only the information about the webinars and online dialogues, but also the registration form that is needed to be filled out in order to join these initiatives. So we have a question. We have a question from Michelle Ashen. She's the founder of Africans United in South Africa. She would like to hear your thoughts about how do we address these challenges in Africa, in particular, bearing in mind youth unemployment. We have also a question from Fernanda from Cetis University in Mexico. I'm sorry, from Sherry Sullivan from the University of Manitoba in Canada. How do we expect faculty to support this work when many do not themselves have an understanding of basic issues like power, marginalization, and racism? So with those questions that we first received, if the panelists would like to reply to those.
Hi.
Yes.
Yes, excellent question about how do we expect the faculty to talk and teach about radicalization when they themselves do not understand issues of power, power dynamics, privilege, and it is very to the point, that question. As an administrator in a large university in Puerto Rico, I face that challenge every day, and my response is that the institution must have clear values and must have within the administration people capable of leading, teaching, and modeling to faculty as well, because faculty, of course, have the freedom of lecture their topics, but the institution has a commitment to the society in general and to some values in particular. Higher education institutions must have a statement of mission and vision and a set of values. That is something that all higher education institutions are required to. And then faculty and administrators must be clear on how those values, how that mission is implemented in their classroom. If a faculty member is not clear on how that works, then it is the responsibility of the institution through their administrators, through faculty development, through faculty meetings, all sorts of possibilities to teach the faculty how to implement those values that they adhere to when they join the institution. And the institution must be very clear about those values. There cannot be any confusion about whether the institution represents those values or not. So it is the responsibility of the institution, the administration of the institution, to make sure that faculty that are hired and do not know how to implement those values, how to take those values to the classroom, they get the skills, the knowledge they had to practice, and they get the support to do it.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Sanabria. Aside from the question that was posed about how to address these issues in the African continent, bearing in mind youth unemployment, we also received a question from Dr. Kevin Grisham from the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University. He says, are we seeing similar approaches being used online when various violent extremist movements? And is there a common set of tools that can be applied by educators to counter these approaches? We also received a question regarding how to prevent violence and ideological unionization. So with that, if any of the panelists would like to comment on those.
So I will answer the question about how we can prevent violence and ideological unionization. I think it's that. Well, I think one way to prevent, I already talked about a little bit of the importance of opening spaces for dialogue and no stigmatization, and safe spaces for people to just being able to talk about their ideology. We at the center, we have learned that confrontation, and we don't do counter discourse. We talk about disengagement from violence. So I think that will be very interesting to see. One, again, like I'm talking about Quebec and Canada, like Quebec specifically. I think we have to be very careful when we start like comparing two different realities. But what I know for certain is that you need people to have the skills to interact with those who have different points of view. And you need to open spaces for people to feel free to talk about what they think, and especially their ideology. Because when we're talking about radicalization leading to violence, we're talking about ideologies. So that will be me.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Cardona. We also received a question from Clindy Odindo from Kenya. So he's asking what research has been done on mental health factors and psychological drivers identified for radicalization and violent extremism. We also received a question in regard to how we mitigate this is from Cesar Perez from Ecuador, Catholic University. How do we mitigate hate and rage, especially in social media? Any of the panelists are more than welcome to answer any of these questions.
Well, at the university, we can teach the students how to read the information they're receiving from the media. So if the media is being radicalized, we have to show the students that the media most times is not neutral. Very often we have more than one media and each has its own agenda. So we have to teach them how to read the editorial line behind the news that are presented. So if you see a message of hate and polarization, we can fight it at the university, at the classrooms, not only by asking the students not to consider that, but rather by asking the students to engage with that information in a more critical way. And the faculty certainly can have a say in how students perceive all sorts of information, but the faculty, as was asked before, must have a set of skills to deal with those challenging issues, with those difficult positions. And the faculty most definitely, as Mrs. Cardona mentioned before, must have the skills to deal with different sets of opinions, with radicalized opinions in a respectful, engaging way, so that to model what is expected of these students of these people also to do, to hear a different perspective, to hear a radical position, and not to shut down immediately to that, but rather to understand where they're coming from, what the point of view is, and how can I understand, accept that position from them, and then present them with a different understanding of that same position, or with a challenging point of view in a respectful way, which is productive. And the faculty, if the faculty don't have that capacity, then it's the institution's responsibility to teach them how to do it.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Sanabria. I believe that Dr. Karimipur wanted to take the floor. We cannot hear you.
So sorry. Just a brief intervention in terms of counter messaging. That is, how do you reach the youth when online messages of hate are being propagated? And of course, it's a tough thing to do, but it really does start at the community level. But even at the national level, which is often where the UN engages governments, we have to work with the central government. Those are our member states. We do encourage them to look for opportunities to reach the young people, not just through the usual channels of education and also youth-oriented programming, but also through sports, because first responders, people who first can identify at-risk youth. By at-risk, I mean at risk of radicalization because of the combination of vulnerabilities and marginalization and poverty and exposure to radical thoughts, are the teachers. But so are parents, and so are sports coaches. And those are the channels where we have cultivated programs for countries where they do engage the youth. Quite often, sports has a very unifying message and effect on young people, where they become much more involved and invested in their community, where they wear the same color and they carry the same flag. And so we have found that there are ways of both inoculating young people against radicalization, but also countering messages of hate when they hear it. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Karimipur. Due to time constraints, we only have time for a couple more questions. So we have one from Diana Papademas. She's asking how to educate our students towards global citizenship, what regional action plans are there that can be adapted to their studies. And then we have Hassan Ashakani from Pakistan. Now he says that the ongoing COVID-19 crisis will have an impact on unemployment, lost income, and increased depression and stress. So he's asking specifically what the UN and the World Bank and other international organizations are doing or are planning to do as a counter strategy, as all these are factors that are catalysts for increased violence. So would any one of the speakers would like to address this?
I can respond to the one about what the World Bank is doing for COVID. We are focusing a lot on health. We're doing a lot of new financing for health, which includes also mental health, initiatives that support mental health. We also are doing a lot in terms of social protection interventions. I think we've financed, since the COVID-19 started, we've financed and expanded on current safety net programs, which actually try to target the most vulnerable and give them cash transfers, whether it is urban poor or rural poor. We are giving them more than what we usually would give in this situation. We've also targeted youth with a lot of public works programs where they join and part of the day they spend working on the public works, but in the afternoon or later in the day, they get a lot of training in terms of skills and time for discussions and things like that. So that is one of the ways we've kind of changed how we usually do business to address some of the COVID issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. De Silva, for your inputs and to present the views of the World Bank. And with that, we have to close the moderated discussion. We are going to circulate a follow-up email with the link to the recording of this UN75 online dialogue, along with additional resources provided by UN offices and the World Bank. Once again, we invite you to go to our website, academicimpact.un.org. We really appreciate your participation in this dialogue. And with that, I hand it over to Mr. Ramu Damodaran, Chief of UN Academic Impact.
Thanks so much, Omar. Just to thank all our wonderful participants, Ms. Nakamitsu, Mr. Karimpur, Mr. Silva, Professor Sanabria, and Professor Cardona. Thank you for joining us, and in particular for allowing time for a conversation. I'm very grateful for the questions and comments that came in. And as Omar mentioned, we will also be sending a follow-up with more answers to some of them. Let me also invite you, as Omar mentioned, to our next event, which is on Thursday, the 4th of June night at 10 p.m. New York time. This is going to be featuring the Rethinking Climate in the context of World Environment Day, which is on the 5th of June. And the reason we are doing it on the 4th night is because it will be the 5th in the Republic of Korea. And we're doing this with the Association of Korean Universities in support of the UN Academic Impact. We have another stellar cast of speakers, including the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Ms. Alice Tabana, the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and several academic leaders. So do join us if you can on Thursday. The details are on our website. But in the meantime, have a wonderful week, and thank you for being with us.